NoHoW is an EU-financed project that use digital technologies in developing evidence-based behavioral approaches for longer-term weight management. It's a 5-year project, and we are currently a little more than 4 years into the project. Whoops. The background is obviously the obesity problem, with many people, quarter of a billion Europeans overweight, up more than 100 million obese, and many of these, more than half, making weight loss attempts every year. The majority who have attempted weight loss have been successful, but the challenge for most people is to keep that weight loss on in the long term. And this is where NoHoW is bridging a gap by looking at the physiological and psychological changes associated with weight loss increase and the probability for weight loss relapse. Whoops. NoHoW has established an evidence foundation. We have used both qualitative and quantitative data to find out how people maintain weight loss. We have looked at weight changes over time, longitudinal, to understand better when people have lost weight, how they regain it and the drivers of that, and identifying where we can possibly be at help. We've used this information to build a toolkit and to test the toolkit. This is a toolkit that is ICT-based to support behavior changes and maintain weight loss. It is a web page, a set of scales, and an app that enables self-monitoring and delivers the intervention. The intervention is a multi-center trial that has been conducted in 3 centers across Europe, Portugal, UK, and Denmark, to help understanding how we might maintain weight loss in the long term. We test in NoHoW if behavior change techniques associated with motivation and with self-regulation of activity and eating, in other words, goal setting, action plans, self-monitoring, and relapse prevention plans, and or stress management and emotion regulation, are effective either on their own or in combination in preventing weight regain among people who have initially lost weight. Whoops. We have tested, we are currently testing the effect of the intervention. We have a 2x2 factorial design where we, on the one hand, examine whether tools for managing stress and emotions versus tools for regulating, for self-regulating activities and motivations, on their own or in combination, are working better than providing simply the intervention in terms of self-weighing and activity measurements. We included 1,600 participants in these 3 centers. Everyone had lost more than 5% of their initial weight. They were all adults and have now been in the intervention for at least 1 year. Here's a distribution very shortly of the randomization that you can see was successful in terms of distributing subjects across the different arms in the 3 different countries, and we have no significant baseline differences across arms or across countries in relation to randomization. Whoops, here it comes. We are, as I said, 12 months into the trial, and what is shown here is the actual versus expected dropout in the trial. And as you can see, the actual dropout is much less than the expected dropout. So where we recruited successfully a little bit more than 1,600 individuals, almost 1,400 of them completed the 6 months intervention, and 1,222 completed the 12 months interventions by the end of February. We still have the 18 months intervention follow-up, which will be completed by September 2019. So what you will hear today is some of the results from the data we have generated. We will be unblinding the data and can in a couple of months probably be delivering the main results from the 12 months intervention. But what we will present to you today is information and results from user engagement. Elina Mattila from VTT in Finland will talk about how this data can enhance our understanding in relation to engagement with digital tools and in relation to behavior change. That will be followed by Sofus Larsen from Region H in Denmark, who will be talking about some of the data from these digital tracking technologies we have been using. Christiane Duarte from Leeds University will talk about appetite traits, emotion regulation and eating behavior in relation to weight loss maintenance in the trial. And Marta Marquez from the Trinity College in Ireland will be talking about and informing us about ontologies for personalized behavior change interventions that can enhance self-regulation, eating and physical activity behaviors. And finally, James Stubbs from the Leeds University will be talking about a novel framework for developing energy balance that can and probably will inform next generation weight management interventions. So without further ado, I would like to call Elina to the stand to talk about some of the user engagement and results from that. Oops, we need to go like that.
Right, thank you, Berit. So my name is Elina Mattila. I work as a senior scientist at VTT Technical Research Center of Finland, and VTT has been responsible for the technical implementation and maintenance of the NoHoW toolkit. And we are also collaborating in analyzing the metadata produced by the intervention to understand user engagement and dose-response relationships of the intervention. Digital interventions enable us to collect very detailed data on how users are actually interacting with interventions. And we know that user engagement is necessary for the effectiveness of digital interventions. If you don't use it, you won't benefit from it. Traditionally, we have been talking about adherence or compliance, but that requires a predefined threshold that the usage is compared to. So we need to know in advance what kind of usage is required. A more recent term that has gained more popularity is effective engagement, which means the minimum level of engagement needed in order to achieve desired effects. And this may be defined in terms of, for example, frequency of use or the content of use, and it may even be person or context dependent. We also need to be mindful of the different levels of engagement. There's the micro level engagement, which means the physical interaction with the technology and the content of intervention. And the macro level engagement, which means engagement with the actual intervention goals. So, for example, if an intervention deals with increasing physical activity, then engaging in physical activity would be the macro level engagement. And most of the data that I'm talking about today deals with the micro level engagement. So as Berit already introduced briefly, the NoHoW toolkit is a web-based intervention for supporting long-term weight loss maintenance. It contains two main parts, the intervention programs. We are testing 3 different intervention programs with the help of the toolkit: the self-regulation and motivation, emotion and stress regulation, and a combination of these two. And does this work? Yeah. Here at the top, you can see how the intervention is presented in the toolkit. So it's a path on a map which helps the users navigate through the program. Then the second part is the tracking. So we have integrated Fitbit weight scales and activity trackers to the toolkit. And then in the toolkit, there is the dashboard that summarizes the data for the user. And then the user can also click those tiles to see graphs on various timescales. And we are currently evaluating this in a randomized controlled trial, as Berit mentioned. And, And the intervention arms get the intervention program based on their arm and the tracking features. And then the control arm only gets the tracking features, meaning the trackers and the dashboard on the toolkit. I'm going to present you with some preliminary results from the first 6 months of the trial. Just a brief summary of what kind of data we are collecting with the intervention. So most of the data is individual level data. We are collecting a timestamped log of page visits in the toolkit, and also information on intervention session visits, user ratings of the sessions, and some more detailed content of the exercises. And we also are collecting self-assessments of mood, weight, steps, sleep, and healthy eating that the participants can enter into the toolkit. And from Fitbit, we get the weight, activity, and sleep tracking data. And we also have some non-individual level data. For example, statistics on video views on the Vimeo service that we are using to deliver the videos, and exercises and forms implemented through an external questionnaire service. So now I'm going to present you some user engagement results. First of all, some basic statistics that are commonly presented in digital interventions. And I'm presenting the results by separating the intervention arms, those are all grouped together, and then the control arm. And for the first 6 months, we can see that the number of visits in the groups, it's pretty similar. So 16 in the intervention arms, 14 in the control arm. But where you see the difference is the duration. So the total duration is nearly 3 hours in the intervention arms and less than 50 minutes in the control arm. Also, the duration per visit differs quite a lot, so about 11 minutes in the intervention arms and a bit over 3 minutes in the control arm. And we can also look at this, the time patterns of usage. So here you can see the proportion of weekly active users during the first 6 months. So as expected, the usage, it always drops in the beginning quite a lot. But we can see that until about week 17, about 40% of both intervention and control arm participants are still using the toolkit. And then there's this quite interesting drop in the intervention arms, but this may have to do with the fact that the intervention program, they may have completed the intervention program and the reminders are stopping around this time. And here we see the weekly duration of use, and here we see clearly that the intervention group is spending a lot more time in the toolkit than the control group. But again, after about 17 weeks, the intervention group declines to the same level as the control group. We also looked at weekly weight monitoring activity, and this is quite high. More than 70% of both intervention and control group users are weighing themselves weekly for the first 6 months. And then we can also look at individual usage patterns. I know that these look quite messy at first, but bear with me. So here I've taken, on the left, we have 400 random intervention arm participants. And on the right side, we have 400 control arm participants. So basically the whole control group. And the participants are on the y-axis and the weeks are on the x-axis. And each of these lines here is an individual usage pattern. And these have been sorted so that the most active users are at the top. And we can see that there are very different usage patterns here. So at the top, we have people who have been using very consistently weekly. Then in the middle, we have people who have been using quite actively, but their activity is declining toward the end of the 6-month period. And then at the bottom, we have some people who haven't been using that much. But we can see that, well, as expected, most of the usage for the whole group is at the beginning. And we can also see the interesting about 17-18 week drop in the intervention groups. And then we also need to look at the use of content, the intervention sessions. And we are going to look at both the visits to the intervention sessions, and then we are going to look at the duration spent in the sessions. Here, this is the visits, and we can see that 66% of intervention arm participants have visited at least 80% of their assigned sessions. So we can be pretty confident that they have been exposed to most of the content that we have. Of course, we have to go into more detail to see if they have actually completed the sessions. And when looking at the time distribution of visiting the sessions, we can see the early enthusiasm here as well. So during the first weeks, they are visiting more sessions, and then by week 17, it's about 1 session per week. So, as a summary, this kind of detailed metadata enables us to gain deeper understanding on user engagement, and it enables more detailed dose-response analysis, even at the level of behavior change techniques. So we can look at effective engagement in terms of overall usage and also the usage of content. We can look at exposure to certain behavior change techniques, compare that to outcomes and to the logic models. And we can also understand individual usage patterns better. We can look at people who responded or didn't respond to the intervention, and maybe we can find personal characteristics that are associated with engagement and effectiveness. Thank you very much.
I suggest we take 1 or 2 questions now and then leave also some time at the end for discussion, if there are questions at this moment for Elina. Yes, please. Is there a microphone? I don't think we can hear you. Is there a technician that can help?
Oh, yeah, that's better. I can hear myself, unfortunately. Thanks for the interesting talk. I just wondered, early on in your slides, you had a graph looking at the active users. Did you have, what did you define as an active user for that period?
Well, that was looking at the users who had visited the toolkit during each of the weeks. So just visiting the toolkit was considered active use.
Is that just like the one? Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Is there another question? In that case, then I'd like to ask Sofus Larsen to come up and talk to us about the tracking technologies and some of the data that has been delivered from that side. Sofus.
Yes, thank you, Berit. So I'll be presenting some insights from the different tracking technologies that we have used to collect data on the NoHoW participants. Graham Hawken is not here today, but he is the NoHoW statistician and has produced most of the slides I'll be presenting today. So first, a brief look at the data that we are collecting in NoHoW. We are continuously tracking information on participants' weight, physical activity, sleep, and as Elina has just mentioned, toolkit usage. Then, of course, the participant gets into visits at the different centers where we measure body weight, anthropometry, blood samples, and blood measures, etc. Then we collect questionnaires, both prior to study entry, so screening and eligibility questionnaires, and also in connection with the different visits at the centers. And finally, we have dietary data as well. And we collect this information using several different systems. So Easy Trial is our trial management software. So we use this to book visits and enter information from the different visits. We collect dietary data with Intake 24, which is a 24-hour recall, online 24-hour recall system. And we collect activity weight information through API calls to Fitbit. And Qualtrics is our questionnaire, online questionnaire system. All this data ends up in the project Data Hub, and as you can see, there's also some communication between the Data Hub and the toolkit, yes. And that's the individualized feedback that's produced based on information from Fitbit, physical activity, sleep, and weight. So this ends up as quite a lot of data. As you can see here, we have 250 gigabytes of data in total so far, and the project is still running, so this will increase during the project. Of course, most of this data is the quite detailed information we have on physical activity and heart rate from the Fitbits, which we collect on a minute-by-minute basis. And just to show the devices we're actually using to collect this information, we use the Fitbit area scale, which measures body weight and body composition, though we don't have too much confidence in its ability to accurately measure body fat percentage. We ask the participants to weigh themselves at least twice a week for the duration of the study, so for the 18 months they're enrolled. Then they also get a Fitbit chart too, and this device measures steps, heart rate, and sleep. And the participants were instructed to wear this device for the duration of the study, so for the 18 months. Of course, they had to take it off for charging and so on. Oops. So why is this continuous tracking of the participants useful? Usually in weight management studies, we tend to observe people at specific time points. So in NoHoW, we get them in for a baseline 6, 12, and 18-month visit. But we also know that this can miss a lot of change that's happening between the visits. So as an example of this, here is data on weight from the Fitbit scales collected for 2 individuals. And you can see the first individual, it actually looks more or less like weight maintenance if we were only to look at the red dots, which indicate their weight at the actual official weighings. But you can also see that if you look at the entire data, it tells a slightly different story. There is quite a lot of fluctuation between the study visits. Another thing that can happen is that when you have an official weighing, this can prompt a behavior change that then prompts a change in weight, and that can be seen from these 2 individuals, where you can see that after a visit, it seems like their weight is changing, and it's not necessarily in a consistent direction. It can go in either direction, and that's, of course, some of the things we'll also try to quantify in the NoHoW study. We can also quite precisely see what happens to participants' weight during specific time periods, and this is probably not that surprising, but as you can see, participants tend to gain a lot of weight during the Christmas holidays and lose at least most of it during January. You can also see the smaller peaks, and these are actually weekend days. So it also looks like the participants gain weight during the weekend and lose it again in subsequent weekdays. And this is some of the data that we have quite a lot of, and this is the physical activity data, or the heart rate and steps data. And we collect this on a minute-by-minute basis, so this means that so far we have more than 500,000 daily patterns like this. And as mentioned, we are still running the study, so this will increase even further. This data is not without challenges. One of the biggest challenges we have is there's quite a lot of missing time points of the data, and this is illustrated here with where we have heart rate data, and the blue lines or dots is illustrating where we have missing data for the participants. And this can be due to several reasons. Of course, they have to take the device off to charge it. The Charge 2 is also not a waterproof device, so every time they go to the shower, they'll have to take it off as well. They may also forget to put it on after charging or after going to the shower. That means we'll have some missed days. We can also have missed nights if they forget to put it on at night. Random loss to contact, and there's probably several other reasons as well. So that's something where we are currently developing protocols on how best to use the data that we have to accurately predict the physical activity patterns for the individuals in NoHoW. So we can use this data to fit curves that describe activity patterns over a day for the participants, as you can see here. Different individuals will show consistent patterns across days, and we can use this to link it to weight outcomes to see if it's linked to better or worse weight loss maintenance. This example is mean steps over 60 days for 5 individuals, and if you can see that the red line indicates an individual that seems to be more active than most of the other individuals. It also looks like this individual is mainly active late in the day, where the green and the blue lines are individuals who are mainly active earlier in the day. Of course, we have the same information for heart rate as well, for the duration of the intervention, which we can also use to get a more accurate measure of physical activity than just steps. Then we have the sleep data, so we can link sleep patterns to changes in weight. And this is an example of an individual that seems to have a quite chaotic sleep pattern. So just to explain, the x-axis 0 is midnight, 1 is 1 o'clock, and -1 is 11 o'clock. This is an individual that seems to have a more common sleep pattern, where we can see that with some variation, it seems to get to bed around 11 o'clock and up at 6 most nights. The exceptions are probably weekends, and then there could be some vacation just before July, perhaps. And of course, the interesting thing in the NoHoW trial will be to explore how this extremely detailed longitudinal data on both physical activity and sleep is linked to changes in weight, but also to look at differences across arms. But since we have just opened up for the possibility to look at the longitudinal data, we haven't got that far yet. But what we have done is we have started to look at the baseline data, where we have looked at the baseline association between sleep duration, or the mean duration of sleep during the first 14 days of the intervention, and different adiposity measures. So you have BMI, fat mass index, fat-free mass index, and waist-hip ratio here. And as you can see, there seems to be a quite clear association between low sleep duration and higher BMI, which is also consistent with what we know from several other studies. When we look specifically at fat mass and fat-free mass, it actually looked like the associations were almost identical, and I've not shown the results for body fat percentage here, but we found no association between body fat percentage or no association between sleep duration and body fat percentage, indicating that at least in our data, the association between sleep duration and body weight seems to be relate total mass and not the distribution of fat and lean mass. We also looked at body shape with waist-hip ratio, measured by waist-hip ratio, and we found similar tendencies in a crude model, but this was not significant after we adjusted for potential confounding factors.
Again, let's have a few short questions. There's one down there, I think.
Excuse me, sorry.
Sorry. Yeah, sorry. Thank you for your nice presentation. Did you try to combine heart rate data with accelerometric data because they measure different things? So, supposing you are interested in energy expenditure as well, you can develop a model including two independent variables like heart rate, accelerometry signal, body weight, body composition, age, sex, gender, blah, blah, blah. Did you try to work this data further?
We haven't done that much yet, but that's definitely some of the things we're planning to do, and James is giving a presentation in just a few minutes on exactly that topic.
Yeah, we will talk about that in a few minutes, Eve.
So you have to stay on, Eve. Another short question? No? If not, thank you, Sophus. And Christiana Duarte, please take the microphone and talk to us about what we have learned from appetite traits, emotion regulation, and eating behaviors in relation to weight loss maintenance in NoHoW.
Thank you. So I'm currently based at University of Leeds, where we are particularly interested in trying to understand the processes and mechanisms of change of the NoHoW intervention. But I come from the University of Coimbra, where we developed the emotion regulation content for the NoHoW toolkit. So today I'm going to talk about, I'm going to focus on the emotion regulation aspects and how emotions can be related to appetitive traits and how these can affect weight loss maintenance. So when we talk about weight loss maintenance, we know that we are facing a series of challenges. So when people try to keep their weight off, when they lose it, they often face the lack of knowledge, so they actually don't know what to do. And this often causes them to engage with popular rather than evidence-based practices. And they do that when they are facing the physiological resistance to weight loss in an environment that makes things really hard. An obesogenic environment that promotes and exploits hedonism, but at the same time that discriminates and stigmatizes obesity. So this creates stress and negative emotions, and this may play a role in all these challenge. So we know that when we are talking about weight loss, there are these aspects, the psychological aspects that interact with the physiological resistance to weight loss. So we have motivational aspects, cognitive aspects, and emotional aspects that all interact and make things really difficult in terms of weight loss maintenance. So this is actually what we often see when we look at weight loss maintenance and weight loss management trajectories. There is weight loss, and then people tend to relapse, and in this relapse we see a huge level of variability. So we need to understand this variability. We need to understand what works for some individuals and what doesn't work. So for some individuals, emotional aspects may play a crucial role. So we need to understand this. Because we need to try to help people to move on from this relapse cycle to a weight loss maintenance cycle. And in NoHoW, we try to do that by implementing this 2x2 randomized controlled trial, where we looked at the effect of emotion regulation, the effect of self-regulation and motivational aspects, and the interaction between the two. And even though the evidence for self-regulation and motivation is quite clear in the literature, the evidence for emotion regulation is not as clear. So we need to understand these mechanisms in regards to emotion regulation. But what do we know? We know that losing weight triggers multiple compensatory physiological signals that oppose weight loss, and that overcoming physiological resistance to weight loss requires the skills of self-regulation, but that emotional stresses, so negative emotions, negative self-evaluation, can undermine these pathways of self-regulation. And so improving emotion regulation may improve the effects of self-regulatory practices and motivational aspects for long-term weight management. So when we develop the NoHoW intervention, that's what we try to do. We try to look at the content of the theoretical constructs that could inform our logic models. And our goal is to develop cause and effect models to try to understand these mechanisms and how these processes interact. And so specifically on the emotion regulation arm, this was our logic model. So the emotion regulation arm on the NoHoW intervention focuses on, is based on contextual behavioral science. So we developed practices related to mindfulness, compassion, and acceptance. And we consider that difficulties in emotion regulation, so decreases in difficulties in emotion regulation throughout the trial may be an important mechanism, a key mechanism that can be associated with greater engagement in healthy behaviors and ultimately on our primary outcome of weight loss maintenance. So just to give you an idea of our baseline participants on the baseline of our project, so this was our primary sample. And in terms of their weight loss maintenance or weight loss methods before they entered the trial, so what helped them to lose weight in the first place, we can see that they know what they're doing. So low-fat diet, engaging in exercise, self-monitoring are aspects that point out as the most important aspects to lose weight. When we asked them whether they perceive this journey as a challenge, as a struggle, they say that yes, this is a struggle for them, and perceived relapse is very frequent in this population. And in terms of helpful factors to lose weight, they point out that self-determination, willpower, motivation, and knowledge of what to do is actually really important. So these people know what to do. So what is the role of emotional aspects in this trajectory? So we try to understand a little bit more about the role of negative emotions and the role of difficulties in regulating negative emotions at baseline. So we produced this path analysis looking at the effect of shame, so a very negative emotion, and difficulties in regulating emotions, and how difficulties in regulating emotions could interact with autonomy, so volition, the ability to engage in healthy behaviors, and how binge eating, so uncontrolled eating behavior measured as binge eating symptomatology, could mediate this association. And so what we saw was that shame is significantly associated with increased uncontrolled eating behavior and previous weight loss attempts. So weight loss attempts here functioning as a proxy of relapse, and that the binge eating symptoms have an indirect effect on percentage weight loss before entering the trial. And interestingly, we also saw that difficulties in emotion regulation actually interact with autonomy. So this points out to this possibility of an interaction between emotional aspects and self-regulatory aspects. And so with these difficulties potentially undermining the ability of participants to engage in weight loss maintenance practices over time. So, but this was retrospective, so our main measure here, our outcome was retrospective measures of previous weight loss attempts and baseline weight loss. So we were interested in trying to understand this in the long term. So we developed a series of, and we are still looking at these results, but just to give you an idea of what we are doing now, we looked at the relationship between difficulties in emotion regulation at baseline and percentage weight loss throughout the 12 months of the trial. And here we are not looking at the effects of the intervention yet, but what we saw was that difficulties in emotion regulation has presented an indirect effect of percentage weight change over time, mediated by a series of appetitive traits related to uncontrolled eating behavior. So we have an indirect effect of susceptibility to hunger, and a similar result, we have a significant association between difficulties in emotion regulation and eating disinhibition at baseline, with eating disinhibition at 6 months presenting a negative association with weight loss over time. And we have similar results for binge eating symptomatology and also for emotional eating over time. But as you can see, the effects on percentage weight change over time are not very, we only have 4% of the variance here, so even though we have significant associations between the theoretical constructs. So this raises a series of questions. What are we actually measuring? How come we have this difficulty in trying to understand or explain a higher proportion of the variance in objective measures of body weight? So just to summarize these results, we can see that at baseline, we see an interaction between theoretical constructs and that difficulties in emotion regulation may play an important role in these associations. But self-reported measures of uncontrolled eating actually show a minimal effect on objective measures of body change over time, body weight over time. So to develop these cause-effect models, we need to understand this. We need to understand whether there are measurement error in these types of psychometric reports, psychometric self-reports, and whether we can use more objective measures of energy balance and energy intake to try to understand the role of these theoretical constructs on actually objective measures of weight change over time. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Christiana. A few questions? Yes, there's a question up here.
Just if we want to understand.
I think we need to wait for a microphone so people can hear.
Hi, my name is Katja. I'm from Denmark. A very quick question, just to understand the intervention. For those people who reported difficulties in emotional regulations, was the intervention personalized in any way? For instance, acceptance-based therapy, or like the use of toolkit, was it personalized to these people? Did they receive a different intervention, or?
No, the toolkit was not personalized to the levels of emotion regulation difficulties for each individual. But from this data, we will be able to understand whether for individuals with greater levels of emotion regulation difficulties, what are the mechanisms that better explain their weight outcomes over time. So this type of analysis, we believe, will inform more personalized solutions that can actually tailor the content of the interventions to individual needs.
And I think Eve had a question, is that right? Did I see you having a question, Eve? No? Okay.
Thank you very much for the talk. I was just wondering if the lack of association that you found was simply because there was not a big enough weight change, or if you think that this would play a role.
Yeah, lack of variability also plays a role here, yeah.
So what was the sort of weight change that you were looking at?
This is something that we're going to face on the whole trial, yes.
Okay.
Do you want to? Oh, it was minimal. So there was not, it was a 0.5 kilogram weight change. Yeah.
Thank you.
Bear in mind, this is a weight maintenance study, not
Exactly.
a weight loss study.
That's not the intervention.
Yeah, but this is a subsample. We did not look at the effect of the intervention. Yeah.
More questions? No? In that case, thank you very much, Christiana. And let's move on to Marta Marquez from Trinity College, who will be talking about ontologies in relation to behavior change interventions to enhance self-regulation behaviors.
Thank you, Berit. Hi, everyone. So I'm not going to present any results today. I'm going to talk about how using ontologies and taxonomies in behavioral science was useful for developing the NoHoW toolkit and content, and how we can use these ontologies to move forward in terms of personalization of interventions. And I know this is a topic that a lot of us in this room are interested. So just to very briefly start with, as in any other interventions, but especially in behavioral science, it's becoming more and more important to understand what are the kind of interventions, and Christiana presented about emotional regulation. We have the example of motivation and self-regulation within the NoHoW toolkit, and it's becoming more and more important to understand which of these components work for whom, in what settings, in what contexts, for how long, how well they work, etc. It's understanding these components of behavioral change interventions that will help us to improve its effectiveness and hopefully its engagement. We also know that a lot of ongoing research in the field still presents a black box, and when we read reports on these interventions, we mainly find the effects of interventions, very briefly information on what the intervention was about, and then some information on the mediators and the mechanisms of action that explain why the intervention was effective or not effective. What we are trying to do in the behavioral science field is understanding a bit further all of these components that are part of this black box that interact to produce a given outcome. And by outcome, this can be in both behavioral outcomes or health-related outcomes. So one way to start making sense of the messy data that we have available at the moment, and being able not only to code interventions but also to develop interventions and produce better reports, is to use taxonomies or ontologies or any other kind of classification systems that organize the content of interventions in a way that we can better report, understand, and be able to establish relationships between these entities. In the area of behavioral change and behavioral science, one of the most well-known forms of classification is the taxonomy of behavior change techniques. So by behavior change techniques, we mean all the active ingredients that are part of an intervention, any given technique that I implement to change a behavior in a subject, and any of these techniques always has to have the potential to change those behaviors. As in most interventions, we don't use only one behavior change techniques, we use clusters of behavioral change techniques that have synergistic effects. So, for example, when I talk about behavior change techniques, I'm talking about goal setting, planning, providing information, all sorts of emotion regulation techniques, etc. More recently, after the success of the development of the behavior change techniques taxonomy, a group of researchers from UCL, in which I participate in this project called the Human Behavior Change Project, has been expanding the use of taxonomies to using ontologies that allow for more dynamic relationships between entities, to understand not only what are the components in terms of, sorry, is this working? Not only the components in terms of what works, of techniques, but also start to classify behaviors, classify duration, classify population, settings, and classify the mechanisms of action. So until now, we didn't have any standardized or shared methods to classify any of these elements within behavior change interventions. For setting and for population, we do have classifications from public health, but not specifically in our field. So the Human Behavior Change Project that, as I mentioned, is led by UCL, is a collaboration with IBM and with colleagues in Cambridge and other departments on the University of Aberdeen also, that are producing a new interface that will be able to provide evidence in real time on the effects of behavior change interventions. So if you can imagine the new interface that is used for the PICO Cochrane collaboration, the idea is that you can ask any question about an intervention. So if you want to ask what are the type of interventions to prevent obesity in children in schools from age 10 to 15, you can enter that information, and with a certain confidence of interval, you will have an answer for which behavior change interventions are more effective so far, according to that confidence of interval, which techniques they use, which mechanisms of action were tested, etc. Not going to talk about the entire project today, just very briefly about the ontological part. So what is being done in the project at the moment is developing classification systems or ontologies for all of these components. So what you see here are any health-related behaviors, mechanisms of action, BCTs and the way, behavior change techniques and the way they are delivered, elements of exposure, elements of the context, and all of these elements interact to produce this given outcome. So what we are doing is developing this ontology for each of them. So at the moment, most of them are already developed and were used in the development of the NoHoW toolkit and logic models. In terms of the methods that are used for ontology development, it starts with a scoping review, trying to identify from the literature and from published reports whatever is available and was reported in terms of intervention features. We then develop preliminary versions of these ontologies, and these ontologies are extensively coded and annotated in hundreds and thousands of intervention report papers. They are subject to expert consensus procedures to produce final ontologies and then establish relationships between these features. In the context of digital interventions, and that's what we are talking about here today, we feel that it is necessary to go a bit further from developing the general ontologies on the components of interventions and start to expand these ontologies to the digital world. So start including features that may not be present in interventions that are face-to-face or done in more traditional modes, but in digital interventions they are relevant. So there are certain behavior change techniques that will be more used in digital interventions, or when we talk about modes of delivery, for example, using gamification features, using real-time feedback, there are a lot of elements that are new in digital interventions and that we also need to capture. So the idea is that these ontologies and its expansion to the digital context will allow us to improve and understand better ways of tailoring and producing adaptive interventions that are based on the needs of each subject. But when we talk about needs, we want to go beyond just understanding user needs and preferences and use the entire schema of the ontologies to identify the relationships between all of that. So how does the user start intervention? What is the context? What are the techniques that work for that user? What are the individual and the social factors that will actually impact and contribute in terms of tailoring? The other aspect that is also relevant is that at the moment we have a lot of personalization features or tailoring features that are developed in the context of digital interventions that are based on algorithms from large data sets, and every time we use Netflix or use any other Amazon, any support online, we see the algorithms providing us suggestions of what we have to do. And what we know in the concept of health behavior change is that the algorithms that are produced so far are quite simple in relation to the complexities of the human behavior. So what we are trying to do is use these ontologies to combine with the data that is existed from these large data sets and use the models to interpret the data. So I want to provide guidance for these predictive models, and at the same time, because the predictive models are so rich, they can also help us to improve the ontologies in itself. So it's a system that will work in a circle. So in terms of the NoHoW trial, you've heard a bit in previous presentations about the NoHoW toolkit. So in the NoHoW trial, we are comparing a component just looking at self-monitoring, and then we have a component looking at emotional regulation, then motivational self-regulation, and a combination of both. The way that the entire content and the features and the principles of the toolkit was built was based on the logic models that we developed. These logic models that were developed following all the guidelines that you probably are aware of to develop logic models for interventions had a very specific component on using theoretical frameworks and theoretical bases as the central component of these logic models. So what we used was the classification systems that I mentioned previously for each of these boxes that you have here. So we select target behaviors based on what is our evidence base for obesity management, but when it comes to identifying mechanisms of action, identifying the techniques that will impact on the mechanisms of action, then we can use these classification systems, we can use the theoretical approaches to help make sense on how these things link together. So we can have 40 or 50 mechanisms of action, 93 techniques, and we can select those that are the best evidence possible. And then we then translate the techniques into the principles and specifications, and Elina showed the map and the way it works in the toolkit. And all of this follows a systematized, shared method of using these classification systems. And you can see here an example of one of the logic models. Just to provide an example of one of the sessions, so what we did for every session in the toolkit for every arm was to select the goals of that arm, the theoretical construct, the intervention techniques, all classified according to taxonomies of behavior change techniques. Why we chose that behavior change technique for that given mechanism of action, and this needs to be based on theory and on evidence. And then how is this implemented within a digital toolkit. For example, for this column that you see here on your right, we don't have yet classification systems to help us identify what is best to use. Is it a video? Is it a quiz? Is it a whiteboard? So we need to use 10, 15, 20 different frameworks that already exist, try to make sense of that information, use a very iterative process to then select which features are we going to use. In the future, if we start reporting these features using a shared method, then we will be able to start accumulating evidence for which features are more effective for which techniques and for which mechanisms of action. By developing the toolkit using this systematic approach, this will also allow us to examine the links between the techniques, the theoretical mediators, but also with the user engagement metrics. And Elina presented earlier today some data that we already have from NoHoW, and we are going to be looking into much more user engagement metrics. And what we are doing at the moment is actually starting to map the different techniques and the different mechanisms of action and different features to all the user engagement metrics. This will start to allow us to create the first steps in terms of personalization. If we start to identify for each individual in which situations which components of the toolkit are actually used and work for these individuals, then we can start selecting in the future what should be the key technique or the key session or the key exercise for this person. Sorry. So in terms of moving forward and using these classification systems, the other line of work that is currently being developed in NoHoW is to start using these methods to understand how can we apply the same principles in terms of classification, in terms of using large data sets to start developing an energy balance framework, and James is going to talk a bit more about that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marta. A few questions for Marta? Eve, please, can we have a microphone here, please?
Thank you for this beautiful presentation. What is the test, retest of a given classification of behavior? Same subject, measured over a week. They are classified in the same category each time for a month. You may assume that there is also intra-individual variability in the behavior. Seasonal, blah, 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 other factors. In women, it may be dependent upon the cycle, and so forth. So when you classify a certain person based on your algorithm, is this classification steady over time, constant over time, or not?
So it's not steady over time, but we haven't got to that stage yet. So at the moment, when we're talking about the classifications at this stage, we're still talking from a conceptual perspective on how we are building the frameworks. And then we'll start looking at the data and applying it. But it's not in a steady way. We are assuming all the dynamics between individuals and within time. I don't know if, James, you want to add something to that.
Eve, I think you're hitting on one of the key issues that we're having in these kind of interventions is how stable are some of the things that we measure over time. The assumption is that they are. It seems probable that they're not. And as Sophus mentioned, in many of these large-scale RCT kind of trials, People measure things at baseline 6 months, 12 months, 18 months. So much stuff goes on between those points in time. And I think one of the things that we're currently grappling with is to what extent can point measurements of behaviours, of inclinations, of psychometric constructs predict what happens over the subsequent 6 months, which takes us again back into the need to track these things over time and to form parsimonious measurements rather than huge batteries of psychometrics that will predict those things. Does that?
Thank you very much.
I think, James, you might as well stay up there, because I think it will be. It's the time where we now hear about the energy balance framework in relation to weight management. James Stops from Leeds University.
I was confused for a minute. Didn't have a keyboard. We've got a lot of data, a lot of potential. We've got metadata, tracking data, ontological data and classificatory systems. And we've got a lot of data on psychometrics. And we've got some problems with those data. And one of the key problems that we have got is that that stuff doesn't predict so much of what we want it to. And we'll talk a little bit about that in the next few minutes. And we'll talk a little bit about maybe what we can do with big data, data analytics. And I think that's one of the themes that's come out of this symposium, is that with all this data, we need new approaches to analytics in physiology, behaviour, psychometrics, classificatory systems. And a lot of that points to machine learning methods, complex algorithms. It's a new area, but it's an exciting area, and it may take us beyond the current situation we're in now. And some of you might disagree with me on this, but my view is that behavioural approaches to weight loss are disappointing. Like, if you weigh 100 to 120 kilograms, and that's what we can give you, you're disappointed. But this is what we currently achieve. It's not much better for weight loss maintenance. This is a systematic review of non-surgical approaches to weight loss maintenance. Oh, I've pressed the wrong button. Hang on. Can anyone see the pointy thing? Nor me. There is. That is the mean of means. So, effect sizes, about 1.6 kilograms over 12 months. Would you be impressed? So what can we do about this? Well, a few years ago, I've put this slide up many times, NIH gave us a framework for what perhaps we can do about this, and they said, well, this is the challenge, and it kind of splits into all of this energy balance stuff, energy balance physiology and energy balance behaviour. And that's the stuff that slows us up, because these are compensatory changes in energy balance, physiology and behaviour, and they undermine long-term maintenance of weight loss. They chip away under the skin. And we can do some stuff about it. Motivation, cognition, pharmacotherapy. And I think this, if you like, is the baseline of where we're at now, and this is what gives us 5 kilograms for loss and 1.6 kilograms for maintenance. And the question is, can we do anything with all that data to take us somewhere better in terms of improved effect sizes of interventions or improved effectiveness through, as Marta said, greater personalisation? And the other thing that this framework says to me is the whole field is not doing itself a favour by being split between detailed, quantitative energy balance investigations, which are highly rigorous here, or extensive, semi-quantitative or psycho-quantitative interventions, which are very extensive here. And these two areas of research do not really cross-translate. They're not really interdisciplinary. And one of the key problems and one of the great ironies in this field is we all want to manipulate long-term energy balance. And one of the reasons we can't is because we can barely measure it. And what I mean by that is that over 6, 12, 18 months, tell me how I can track long-term energy intake. Tell me how I can track long-term energy expenditure within and between people on a day-to-day basis. So we do not have a quantitative framework which joins these two areas of research or joins our interventions to the key outcome we want to achieve, which is long-term weight loss, maintenance, and health outcomes. So a key question with all these data is, can we close this gap? So Sophie's kind of put half this slide up earlier on, making the point, and we've already discussed it with Eve, that in these interventions we make these periodic frequent measurements. They're still not that frequent. Awful lot of stuff goes on in between. Awful lot of stuff we are missing in the development of these kind of models where we've got theoretically informed interventions, we construct our logic models, we try and specify sequences of events which give us causal relationships. So, one of the great things in NoHoW is we've got these tracking things, and we've got a lot of data. So, for the tracking data, we've got about 1.2 billion data points at the present time. For the weight data, we've got hundreds of thousands of data points. And as Alina has already mentioned, for the toolkit usage, we've got similar amounts of data on who uses which components, when and how. What can we do with that stuff? Well, I hope one of the things that we can do is we can start to close this gap between energy balance physiology and large-scale behaviour change interventions. And to try and do that, we need to take another look at tracking technologies. And I'm sure Eve is sitting over there thinking, come on, we've been thinking about this for 20 years. So what's new? Well, one thing that is new is the data collection and aggregation capabilities of these things is now vast. They give objective measures of physical activity. We'll talk about how good those things are. They give us minute-level data. They're very cheap. And if you wear them here, they're broadly accepted by many consumers. The cons is the issue of accuracy and the issue of proprietary algorithms. And we'll look at that. And one of the key people who has been looking at this stuff is Rory O'Driscoll, who's been doing a PhD at Leeds. And he's taken a very novel, quite an exciting, structured approach. The first thing he's done is he's asked the question, how good are these things? And I don't think anyone is going to be surprised at the results here. Large-scale meta-analysis, recently published, 60 studies, 40 devices, pretty much everything that's out there on the market, 6 activity types, all compared to criterion measures, heart rate, indirect calorimetry, and a moderated analysis to look at the importance of specific sensors, accelerometry, heat sensors, and heart rate. So here's the lack of surprise. Validity of these things isn't great. Highly variable between activities. Interesting suggestion, as made by Eve prior to publication. If you combine heart rate and accelerometry, you can reduce the error. That's interesting, and we'll explore that. So this forest plot basically shows mean and means, not so bad, individual devices and activities all over the place. These are the implications. If we can continuously monitor physical activity, maybe energy expenditure, we can translate those activity counts into actual bioenergetic measures, real energy expenditure. If we can track energy expenditure along with body weight, as we have been doing in NoHoW for 18 months per person, we've got two of the three components of the energy balance equation. We can resolve the third. We can develop a quantitative energy balance framework based on behaviour. I think we all know how that works. It's simply the first law of thermodynamics, and these things give us this. These things give us an estimate of physical activity, and we need to be able to cross the bridge from physical activity to energy expenditure. That is the key challenge. If we can do that, we can resolve the equation. And recent advancements in tracking technologies actually make this possible when combined with data analytics. And that's what's so exciting. What's less exciting is this mouse is not helping me. So we've known for years that you can use accelerometry combined with biosensor data to make estimates of energy expenditure. We just know it hasn't been so great, and the models haven't been so great either. But a key thing to recognise is that these estimates are often poor not because the technologies are poor. Technologies are pretty good. It's because of the assumptions of the algorithms, and the algorithms are proprietary. We don't know what people are doing with that stuff. It's all tied up in stuff we can't access. So theoretically, it should be possible, if we can extract raw data from these things, that we can actually calculate and cross the bridge from movement to energy expenditure. That requires a completely new approach to complex modelling, which unfortunately we're not going to have time to talk about in detail here today, but we will later in the year. And if we can accurately estimate energy expenditure and track body weight, we can track energy balance in humans over time. Again, this is not entirely new. This is the NIH model, which I think most of us are familiar with, when you can actually input estimated changes in physical activity in calories per kilogram today and changes in body weight and get an estimate as an output of change in energy expenditure over time plus a 95% confidence interval. That's estimated physical activity. If you know and can quantitate physical activity as energy expenditure, this model suddenly becomes much more exciting. So then Rory and the team have already done a proof of concept study. This is the first time we've mentioned it anywhere in public. And it's to investigate the extent to which tracking devices can be used to estimate energy expenditure using movement data, using heart rate data, raw data as far as possible, as raw as it can get, in comparison to criterion measures at every point. So we've got an objective calibration. And he's worked to explore methods to improve energy expenditure estimates with moment-by-moment data using complex machine learning algorithms. That involved developing, firstly looking at the nature of the data, the way it operates, and developing the kind of algorithms that will best describe that. I'm only showing you data from a Fitbit today, but actually we're looking at a variety of devices, and the interesting thing in the context of this discussion is the Fitbit is the one that's the least good. So the data I'll show you in a minute, the rest of the devices are even better. And it's a standardized protocol comparing momentary heart rate and movement variables from these devices to criterion measures using an incremental standardized physical activity protocol in 59 people. And that the criterion measures are polar heart rate for heart rate and indirect calorimetry for energy expenditure. And this, first time ever, in public. Well, not this bit. This is the Fitbit thing. Out of the box, Fitbit estimate of energy expenditure against measured energy expenditure. It's quite noisy. That's what trackers do. That's what modelling does. It dramatically reduces the noise or the error compared to a criterion measure. And if we look at that as a Bland and Altman, so in these models, what Rory's done is he's trained the algorithms on 80% of the data and then estimated energy expenditure parameters on the 20% of the data it has not seen. And you can see the error is dramatically reduced. It's also worth pointing out that the other devices reduce the error even further. It's also worth pointing out that these measurements are getting as close to, as good as, or better on a 24-hour basis than double label water, except you get 24-hour estimates, day-to-day energy expenditure, which we've never had before. So the potential of these things is considerable. Yes, there are assumptions, and yes, we need to look at the models in different circumstances and parameters. This is what happens when you do a leave one out validation, which is what a tracker does out there in real life. Like a Fitbit telling me my energy expenditure is a leave one out validation. It's done all of its calculations. I'm the one out. If you do that with these models, train it on 58 of 59 people, that's the uncorrected data, corrected data. Drastic reduction in the errors. This is showing us the potential of taking big data analytics to something that we've played with for a long time and getting something which is new, exciting, and will help us in the kind of approaches we've been talking about this afternoon. So Marta has talked about big data analytics and ontologies. Alina has talked about big data analytics. And so in using those ontologies, we can enhance and develop the kind of rigor we've already built into behaviour change interventions. The stuff Alina is talking about gives us a quantitative framework so we can actually relate all those measurements and all of those theories and psychometric measurements to actual user behaviour. So we can put a quantitative framework, who used which components of the intervention, where and when, what was the effective dose. By taking data analytics to tracking energy balance in its components, we can put a quantitative energy balance framework on the bottom of that. And that means that we've got the potential to bring together in a quantitative framework behaviour change interventions and energy balance outcomes. So in principle, we can directly measure the effective dose of interventions. We can understand better the mechanisms of action of those interventions, and we can determine how intervention components impact energy intake, expenditure and balance over time. And that is where I think big data analytics will take us in the future, to more personalised, effective interventions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, James. I'll open your paper up for discussion, but I'll also ask the presenters to come up and sit here, and we'll take first a few questions for James and then open up the discussion for everyone. Questions for James? Amanda, there's coming up a microphone.
Thank you. This was so exciting. It's really frustrating when they're all proprietary equations and you can't understand how they're getting them. So when will your algorithms be available? You know, when can we go on a website and access them, and what will the cost be? And is it based on particular populations? So will each research group need to create the algorithms for their particular population under study?
Well, that was several questions. But the answer to the first part of the questions is it depends on whether it's an invention. The answer to the second part of the question is the more data we have, the better we can understand how these algorithms operate. And the data comes from the circumstances under which you do the calibrations, the input from the sensors, and the number of raw outputs from those sensors. So that the Fitbit just gives you 2 raw outputs, steps and heart rate. It's pretty limited. There are other sensors that give you 20 to 22 activity parameters and heart rate. And the more data, the better. And yes, there will be population specificity, but it won't be specific to whether they're, for instance, in Australia or the UK, I hope. But if they're children, if they're elderly, semi-ambulatory as opposed to healthy adults, are going to likely be the kind of factors. If we can move, the more data, the bigger the data sources, the more generalizable the equations, and hopefully the more accessible they will be.
Okay, we can take now questions for everyone, including James. So Eve.
Thank you for the very beautiful presentation. When you track body weight change and you don't know body composition, how do you decide about the energy density of weight change, which is an important variable in your equation, EI minus EE plus delta S, which is energy stored? So if you need energy stored in the equation, and you have only body weight, you have to assume that the body composition of weight change is constant for everybody, correct?
Yeah, the models would be better if you have the composition of weight change. The bigger the sample, the less the problem. The more variable the sample in terms of the composition of the weight change, the bigger the problem. So you can make a reasonable estimate in a large sample of people of the energy cost of weight change unless there's somebody doing something really weird in there. It gets more problematic at smaller sample sizes and bigger changes in the composition of those changes. But remember, in NoHoW, we're tracking 1,600 people several times a week over 18 months.
So you don't track changes over a short period of time? Because then the energy density of weight change will be very low. Let's say 1 calorie per...
the errors...
If you track over 6 months, you are much safer to do a hypothesis about the energy cost of weight change.
And
right?
over shorter periods of time, the errors associated with the assumptions of the energy content, composition and cost of weight change escalate.
We have a question up here, please.
Thank you so much for the wonderful presentation. Just reflecting a little bit on the fact that it's weight maintenance and user engagement, and the fact that I think you only had 17 visits in the intervention group out of 1,200. So maybe I misunderstood the data, but it seems that if we had to generalize what works in the weight maintenance phase is the lowest possible effort, because all the data points that you are getting and consistency required either reduced user effort or minimal user effort or passive data collection, if possible. Would that resonate with your vision?
No, I don't think... first of all, there were not 17 visits.
17 weeks.
The toolkit was delivered actively.
The median of 16 visits per participant in the intervention arm.
So this is per participant?
Yes.
Over 6 months. Okay, great.
Well, it's the median.
Yeah. I see. But do you see a difference between more passive effort versus active effort required from the users through specific intervention, especially in the weight maintenance phase, because obviously the most of the effort was done during the weight loss phase, more active effort from the users. So now in the weight maintenance phase.
What's your construct for active effort? Active effort to engage with...
Active input, doing something, actively reading. I don't know what's exactly in the toolkit from
I don't
your
think the effort
presentation.
associated with one module would have been any greater or less than another module.
I don't think we have comparison between passive or active effort in the toolkit. So it all require the user to log in, interact with the system, read, do quizzes, etc.
Okay.
I think you might be referring to data that comes from using activity trackers, which is a different thing. So I think the question is in terms of should we use more of the activity that comes from activity trackers, or is it the information that user has to interact with? But I don't think we have that.
We have
basis for
the data,
comparison.
but we haven't done the analyses.
Okay. Thank you.
That's a question down at the back.
Hello, Marika Badaham here from the University of Wollongong in Australia. I'm a biostatistician. I was just wondering if you could give me any more information about your machine learning algorithms. For example, what class of machine learning algorithms you're using to do this?
We can't specify that at the present time.
Okay, so stay tuned, is that?
Yeah,
Yep.
there are clearly classes of algorithms that have been evaluated, and we've worked quite extensively, but we're not prepared to, or able in fact, to reveal what they are until we've been told by the Research Innovation Service essentially whether we can or not. We will need to for publication, so that's why we're basically saying this is stuff and these are results, and we're not telling you what the stuff is until we get the okay on that.
Thank you.
My apologies.
Other questions? Am I missing someone? Anyone who wants to add something from the panel? Well, with all the secrets, I understand that there might not be more questions. In that case, thank you very much for everyone turning up, and thank you to the speakers.